You can't just leave! Come back here and face me!
Not you, Harlan Pike said at the moment Eleanor Whitaker stepped onto the platform at Coldwater. The season's first snow slanted through the locomotive smoke and caught on the brim of her hat. Behind Nell, the rail car shuddered with steam. In front of her stood the man who had spent 7 months writing that he needed a wife who could keep a house, balance accounts, and endure the frontier. Harlan's gaze traveled from her traveling boots to the wine-colored cloak wrapped around her full figure. It stopped at the breadth of her hips, as though he had discovered merchandise packed in the wrong crate. "Mr. Vane," he called loudly, "you said she was healthy. You didn't say she was like this." A few laughs broke out beneath the station roof. Nell kept one hand on the handle of her small trunk. At her feet, a tin storm lantern tapped softly against the lock. "Your letters asked whether I could bake, keep books, and preserve meat," she said. "Not one of them asked about my waist." Harlan's face reddened. "A man has a right to know whether his wife will fit a saddle." "You might have asked before letting me travel 1,000 miles. Silas Vane stepped out of the station office. His black wool coat looked unnaturally clean amid the slush and mud. He owned the station, the warehouse, and the inn, and he had guaranteed the marriage. "Miss Whitaker," he said, "no one in Coldwater forces a man to accept something he did not agree to." Something. The word fell colder than the snow. Harlan turned away. His mother lifted her skirts around Nell's trunk as though avoiding dirty water. Nell heard the train wheels grinding against the rails. "Does the inn have a room?" she asked. "Do you have money?" "I'll work. The kitchen has enough hands. So does the laundry." Silas looked her over. "Winter burns more firewood than promises. I don't house people without money, a husband, or a guarantor." In a few minutes, the train would take the last road east with it. Nell looked at the trunk. 2 dresses, a ledger, sewing needles, Harlan's letters, and Aunt Martha's storm lantern. Her whole life lay beneath one wooden lid. She did not cry. Tears would not buy a bed or keep a fire alive through the night. Wood cracked sharply. The freight horse reared. A brake pin sprang loose from the axle. The wagon, stacked high with flour sacks, began sliding down the slope beside the warehouse, its iron-rimmed wheels bouncing over frozen planks. A boy holding an armload of firewood stood paralyzed at the bottom. "Move!" someone shouted. Nell was already running before the cry ended. She snatched a coil of hemp rope from the freight pile, looped it around the signal post, and tied a double friction hitch the way Aunt Martha had taught her at the grain warehouse. She flung the other end toward the wagon's rear brace. The first throw missed. On the second, the iron hook caught the rope. Nell wrapped the line around her forearm, dropped her weight, and braced with everything she had. The jolt dragged her across frozen mud. Rope screamed over the post, filling the air with the scorched smell of hemp. The wagon slowed. Just enough. A porter rushed in and scooped up the boy. 2 other men jammed blocks beneath the wheels. 3 sacks of flour tumbled off,
You can't just
but the
leave.
rest of the load stopped less than an arm's
back here
length
and
from the
face me.
tracks. Nell released the rope. Both palms were bleeding. No one laughed now. She knelt in front of the boy. "What's your name?" "Ben." "Are you dizzy?" He shook his head. "Count my fingers." 5. Sit still until your legs stop shaking. A pair of worn leather boots stopped beside her storm lantern. The man standing there was so tall the station awning seemed to sag above him. Snow dusted the shoulders of his buffalo coat. His old buckskins were dark at the elbows. A white scar ran along his left jaw and vanished into a black beard streaked with silver. His hair was tied at the nape. A long rifle rested on his shoulder as naturally as another limb. His gray eyes did not look at Nell's bleeding hands. They studied the knot, the angle of the wheel, and the flour sacks that had survived. "You know how to manage provisions?" he asked. "I know how to calculate rations. I know wet flour, spoiled meat, and a short shipment when I see them. Can you keep your head when someone's hurt?" "Depends whether they're willing to listen." The corner of his eye shifted. Malcolm Rourke. The name made several people step back. The mountain man from Grey Wolf Pass. The one who lived where snow erased even a horse's tracks. Malcolm looked at Silas. "I need someone at Pine Watch for the winter." "This is none of your concern," Silas said. "It is now." He turned back to Nell. "I have a cabin, a provision store, trap lines, and a 9-year-old niece. I have to hunt. I need someone to keep the books, keep the fire, and keep the girl alive while I'm gone." Nell wiped the blood from her hands onto a handkerchief. "In exchange? Shelter, legal protection, a share of the profits, a civil marriage until the pass opens." He paused. "Come spring, you may leave. You'll owe me nothing. And a husband's rights?" Malcolm's gaze never left hers. "No rights over your body that you do not choose to give." The train gave its final whistle. Nell looked at Harlan, who would not meet her eyes, then at Silas, who had just called her a thing. At last she looked at the man who smelled of hides and wood smoke. He did not tell her she was beautiful. He did not tell her she was pitiful. He only asked whether she could keep a house alive through winter. "I want every condition in writing," Nell said. "Done. The profit share gets a number." "Done. And I keep a key." Malcolm nodded. "The territorial clerk stays in his office until the train leaves." Silas stepped forward. "There's no need to rush. By morning I'll find another arrangement." Malcolm looked up at the leaden clouds crawling over Black Pine Peak. "By morning, the pass may be closed." Nell picked up the storm lantern. The metal was bitterly cold in her hand. "I haven't said I'll marry you. No, I said I'll read the agreement. Then come read it." Malcolm lifted her trunk with one hand, but he did not walk ahead. He waited for Nell to choose the direction. She headed toward the territorial clerk's office. Behind them, Silas Vane was no longer smiling. He returned to his private office, locked the door, and opened the bottom drawer of his desk. Inside lay a thick envelope with a cracked blue wax seal. Written across the front were the words, "Eleanor Whitaker, regarding title to Cinder Meadow." Silas watched through the window as Nell's storm lantern disappeared into the snow, then shoved the envelope beneath Harlan Pike's debt ledger. The door to the territorial clerk's office flew open under Malcolm's shoulder. Inside stood a red-hot iron stove, an ink-stained wooden desk, and an old man in spectacles hurriedly putting away papers. Snow lashed the glass like white sand. Nell set the lantern on the desk. "I want to read every line." The clerk looked at Malcolm, as though waiting for the man to answer for her. "Give her the paper," Malcolm said. The old man drew out a marriage form. Malcolm stood behind Nell, his buffalo coat dripping snowmelt onto the floor. He did not hurry her. Nell read the sections on names, property, and obligations, then picked up a pencil. "This isn't enough." "What part?" "The right to leave." The clerk frowned. "Marriage isn't a hiring contract." "Then don't call it a winter agreement." Nell looked at Malcolm. "I have my own room." "Yes." "My own key." "Yes." No one enters my room unless I give permission. Malcolm nodded. You have no right to demand my body because of this paper. The clerk coughed and bent his head, suddenly absorbed in finding ink. Malcolm kept his eyes on her. Write it in. Nell continued. 1/3 of the profits after expenses. I have the right to inspect the books. Agreed. You pay my train fare when Grey Wolf Pass opens. If I leave, I owe nothing for food, firewood, or protection. Agreed. And if you die, Malcolm held her gaze a moment longer. You keep your share. Annie keeps hers. Nell set down the pencil. Who is Annie? My niece. Her parents? Dead. One word closed the door on every other question. The clerk added the terms in a trembling hand. When he passed the pages to Malcolm, Malcolm read each line slowly. His broad hand held the edge of the paper with more care than Nell had expected. Silas Vane appeared in the doorway. Mr. Caro, the train is about to leave. There's no need to rush the seal. There is, Malcolm said. Silas entered. Hasty marriages invite disputes. I only want to be certain Miss Whitaker understands that this man lives 4 days beyond the reach of the law. I understand that you're standing between the desk and the seal, Nell replied. Silas's eyes darkened. Caro gathered the 3 pages. Silas took the last one, saying he would carry it into the station office for sealing ink. Malcolm put out a hand and stopped him. Seal it here. Silas gave a thin smile. You suspect me? Yes. Caro stamped the first 2 pages. At that exact moment, the train whistle shrieked and rattled the windows. A porter burst in to report that the north rail was icing over. In the confusion, Silas drew the 3rd page toward himself and slipped it beneath the registry book. Nell saw one corner disappear. What about that page? Silas lifted it, holding the edge so it covered the place where the validating seal should have been. The signatures are enough. Malcolm did not believe him, but snow clouds had swallowed nearly all of the western peaks. He signed. Nell signed after him, the name Eleanor Whitaker clear and straight. The clerk declared them husband and wife under territorial law. No ring, no vows, only wet ink and the long cry of the train outside the station. Harlan waited beneath the awning. You don't know what you've just done. I know more than you think. Rourke lives like an animal. Folks say he killed 2 trap thieves and left their bodies in the snow. Malcolm was tying Nell's trunk to the freight wagon. He did not turn around. Harlan lowered his voice. Undo this. Mr. Vane can find someone else, someone more suitable. For whom? Harlan looked away. Nell understood that he was only afraid a scheme had slipped from his grasp. I traveled 1,000 miles because of the letters you sent. I didn't write all of them. The words came out too quickly. Harlan went pale. What do you mean? Nothing. He backed away. Go up the mountain then. You'll learn that being alone in the snow with him is worse than being rejected. Nell looked at Malcolm, checking the action of his old rifle. He did not ask what Harlan had said, and he did not pull her away. Malcolm placed an iron key in her palm. Pine Watch. The key was cold and heavy. You're giving it to me before I've even seen the place? You signed. That means I'm allowed inside. It doesn't mean I'll have a voice. Malcolm tightened the final strap. A door is locked to keep out a storm, not to keep in a person. They left Coldwater as snow began filling their wagon tracks. Malcolm rode ahead. Nell sat on the wagon among flour, salt, ammunition, and lamp oil. The 2 mules breathed white into the air. The Black Pine Range rose before them like a dark wall. An hour later, The left mule stumbled. "Stop," Nell said. "We have a long way to go." "Something's wrong with its foot." Malcolm reined in. Nell climbed down and knelt beside the animal's hoof. The heel was hot and swollen, and a sharp stone had lodged along the edge. "Keep going and it'll go lame." Malcolm crouched. He pried out the stone with his knife and examined the swelling. "When did you notice?" "When it started pulling the breast strap crooked." He did not praise her. He simply moved 2 sacks of salt to the other mule. Nell looked up and saw the rear tarp billowing strangely. "The flower lashings are coming loose too." The wind tore a long split through the canvas. Snow spilled into the mouths of the sacks. Nell climbed onto the wagon, stitched the tier temporarily with cord, then tied the cover crosswise. Malcolm held the wheel so the wagon would not slide. Nearly half an hour later, they moved on. A deep roar sounded ahead. The slope above the trail collapsed. Rock, frozen mud, and pine trunks swept across the stretch of road they should have reached by then. The mules panicked. Malcolm hauled on the reins and forced the wagon against the mountainside. Nell watched snow dust boil over the ravine. "Do you still think we should have kept going?" Malcolm looked at her, his gray eyes narrowing. "No." One word, this time an admission. They detoured along a narrow game trail. Night fell as the pines closed behind them. Malcolm made camp beneath a rock overhang, tethered the animals, built a fire, and divided the dried meat. On his saddle, Nell noticed a short length of knotted cord. 3 tight knots, 1 loose loop, then 2 knots close together. "Annie's?" Malcolm nodded. "She made it to remember the order of the trap lines. You said she doesn't speak." "Not since the slide." Firelight caught the scar along his jaw. "Her parents died in it?" "Yes." "Were you with them?" Malcolm stared into the red coals. "I didn't get there in time." Nell asked nothing more. Some answers deserved to be left alone. She wrapped the Pine Watch key in her handkerchief and tucked it close to her chest. Ahead lay a strange cabin, a silent child, and a husband who knew more about traps than people. Behind them, Coldwater had vanished beneath the snow. Malcolm rose to check the animals' lines. When he turned his back, Nell saw the edge of a marriage page protruding from his document pouch. 2 pages bore red seals. The last held only signatures. No validating stamp. Pine Watch appeared beyond a bend in the trail after snow had whitened the backs of both mules. The black pine cabin hugged the mountainside, its steep roof burdened with old snow. A stone chimney breathed a gray ribbon into the leaden sky. Behind it stood a smokehouse, a fur shed, and a stable, connected by paths cut through the drifts. Farther out, stakes marking the trap lines vanished among the pines. Malcolm dismounted first. He did not offer Nell a hand. He only held the wagon wheel steady while she climbed down. The lack of gallantry relieved her more than courtesy would have. The cabin door opened before they reached the porch. A thin little girl stood in the shadows. Her brown hair brushed her shoulders, and she wore a gray wool dress. Both hands clutched a length of cord crowded with knots. She looked at Nell, then at the trunk and lantern, as though counting how much space the stranger intended to take. "Annie," Malcolm said, "this is Nell." The girl did not answer. Malcolm carried in the flour. Nell lifted her own lantern and bag. As she crossed the threshold, Annie stepped back, her bare foot slipping on the deerskin rug before the stove. The cabin was warm but not gentle. The hearth occupied nearly half a wall. Old rifles hung from the rafters. Dried herbs, Iron traps, bridles, and pelts had been arranged according to the habits of a man who lived alone. A faded woman's shawl still hung in one corner of the kitchen. Nell did not ask whom it had belonged to. Malcolm pointed to the small door beside the pantry. "Your room." He set her trunk outside the threshold and stepped back. He did not enter. The room held a narrow bed, a wash basin, and a peg driven into the wall nearly level with Malcolm's shoulder. Nothing suggested the place had ever expected her. But the lock was new. Malcolm looked at the key in Nell's hand. "It locks from the inside. And your key?" "I don't have one." Nell tested the lock. The iron bolt slid firmly into place. He led her through the pantry and first door, then down a narrow stairway behind the stove. Beneath the floor ran a firewood tunnel that opened through a small door in the hillside. If snow blocks the front door, use this way. Or if someone gets into the house who shouldn't. Malcolm studied her for a beat. That too. When they returned upstairs, Nell saw Annie beside the old shawl. Nell reached up, meaning only to make room for her own coat, but the girl snatched the shawl down and clutched it to her chest. Nell withdrew her hand. "Was it your mother's?" Annie gripped the cloth tighter. "I won't touch it." The girl remained wary, but she did not run. Malcolm took off his buffalo coat. 3 raised claw marks showed beneath the buckskin at his shoulder as he bent to tend the fire. Nell turned toward the pantry. "Show me the books." He pointed to the table by the window. The thick, hide-bound ledger had a cracked spine and smelled of gun oil and smoke. Malcolm's slanted writing listed beaver pelts, salt, flour, lead shot, coffee, and lamp oil. Nell picked up a pencil and began to count. 2 flour sacks at the back of the room were dark along the bottom. She cut the stitching, reached inside, and smelled the contents. Damp. The tarp tore on the road. Not just today. The flour has clumped in the middle. Malcolm knelt and squeezed a handful. His jaw tightened. Nell kept going. The salt crock was less than half full, though the ledger showed another 40 pounds received from Coldwater. The venison in the smokehouse hung too close to the roof. The heat would dry the surface while trapping moisture inside. The ammunition chest was short, nearly 30 rounds. "Did you use cartridges without recording them?" "No." "Did anyone else take them?" "No one comes up here." Nell turned back through the delivery pages. The last 3 shipments had all passed through Silas's warehouse. Malcolm had received less than he had paid for. Then the goods disappeared somewhere between Coldwater and Pine Watch. Malcolm stood motionless in the pantry. "I've kept this place for 12 years. Nell heard what he did not say. She had been there one day and had already found holes he had missed. "I'm not saying you don't know how to live in the mountains. You're saying my stores won't last the winter. I'm saying our stores won't last if we keep dividing them the way you have." The word "our" changed something faintly in his eyes. Nell set down the ledger. "The damp flour has to be separated now. We'll dry what can be saved beside the stove. Every piece of meat needs to be lowered and checked. Divide the salt 3 ways: curing, cooking, reserve. Lock the ammunition separately. From this day on, anything that leaves the pantry goes into the book." "You plan to weigh every slice of bread?" "If I have to." Malcolm looked at her, then took out another small key and set it beside the ledger. "Pantry lock." The second key was lighter than the key to the front door, but it carried more weight. The afternoon passed in the smell of damp flour and smoked meat. Nell spread cloths and sifted what could still be saved. Malcolm lowered the hooks in the smokehouse. He did not argue again. He simply followed the orders she had given. Annie sat at the table. silently arranging pebbles in 3 rows. When Nell turned her back, a piece of cornbread vanished. That night, she found a cloth bag beneath Annie's bed containing hard bread, 2 potatoes, and a strip of smoked meat. It was not much, but it was enough to show that the girl did not trust tomorrow's food to remain. Nell did not take the bag. Beside it, she placed 3 pebbles and a scrap of paper marked with 3 strokes: morning, noon, night. Annie watched from the corner of the room. No one will take your share, but food under the bed will mold. Tomorrow morning you can carry it down to the pantry yourself, or you can let me do it. You choose. Annie turned her face away. Night came quickly. Wind pressed against the cabin walls. Nell lay in her own room and listened to Malcolm check the door, the stable, and the stove. He paused outside her room for a moment, but he did not test the latch. Then the snow slid from the roof. The sound exploded like the whole mountainside coming down. Something struck hard inside Annie's room. Nell sprang up. Malcolm was already in the hall with an oil lamp. His hand touched the bolt on Nell's door, then stopped. "Nell, I'm all right." From Annie's room came ragged breathing and the scrape of fingernails on wood. Malcolm moved to the door. "Annie, open up." The silence inside grew deeper. Nell saw his hand clench. The man could face a grizzly, yet he did not know what to do before the door of a child whose parents he had failed to save. "Let me try." He stepped aside. Nell sat on the floor outside the door. She did not call Annie sweetheart. She did not say everything was all right. Those words meant nothing to a child who had once heard a mountain collapse over her head. Nell took the knotted cord from the table and pushed it beneath the door. "3 knots are the 3 people in this house," she said. "1 loop is the door. The door is still there." No answer. She tied another knot well apart from the first 3. "This knot is the snow. It's outside." Nell waited. The stove popped. Malcolm leaned against the wall, silent as a pine trunk. At last, the cord was pulled inside. A little while later, it slid back out. Annie had moved the snow knot farther away, almost to the end of the cord. Nell rested her palm on the floor. That's right. The latch shifted softly but did not open. Nell remained there until the breathing inside slowed. When she rose, Malcolm did not thank her. He crossed to the tin storm lantern resting on her trunk, lit it, and hung it from the peg beside the front door. Its golden light fell over the pantry key in Nell's hand. "We inspect the smokehouse tomorrow," she said. "Yeah." Outside, the wind changed. The air turned strangely warm. From the smokehouse roof, a single black drop of water fell slowly into the snow. Then another. The 3rd black drop struck the snow before Malcolm could open the smokehouse door. A damp, salty, rank breath rolled out. The strips of venison nearest the roof had begun to sweat. Along some cut edges, the dark red had turned gray. Nell stepped in behind him, pressed a finger to one piece, and smelled it. "Take everything down." Malcolm looked at the rows of hooks stretching wall to wall. "All of it? Leave it 1 more day, and there'll be nothing left to choose from." He removed his buffalo coat, rolled up his buckskin sleeves, and began pulling down the meat. Nell spread clean cloths on the floor and divided the pieces into 3 piles: sound, salvageable, and ruined. Not much had spoiled yet, but the amount of salt remaining made every calculation ugly. "Enough until March?" Malcolm asked. "Not without more game." I'll ride the North Line tomorrow. Tomorrow you stay here." His gray gaze settled on her. "We'll lose the beaver pelts if the storm comes down. We'll lose this meat before sundown." Malcolm turned back to the hooks. That was his answer. They worked until their wrists went numb. Nell trimmed the damp portions, rubbed the little salt they had into the meat, and had Malcolm nail lower-hanging rails into place. She opened vents on opposite walls so the smoke would cross the room instead of collecting under the roof. The most doubtful pieces were sliced thin and carried into the cabin to dry beside the stove. Annie sat at the corner of the table, watching every ration being weighed again. Nell drew 3 columns in the ledger: meat, flour, beans. Each mark stood for 1 day. She reduced the meat ration but increased porridge and dried beans. When Nell went back to the smokehouse, Annie was gone. The little chair had been shoved aside. The back door stood ajar. Small footprints ran across the snow toward the woods. Malcolm reached for his rifle. She knows this country. Knowing it doesn't mean she isn't afraid. Nell took the storm lantern. Malcolm started to follow, but she looked toward the meat still lying outside the smoke. "You tend the fire. I'll bring her back." "Nell, if we both leave, the meat spoils, and if you find Annie with a rifle in your hands, she'll think she's about to be hunted down." Malcolm set the gun aside. "There's a hollow pine near the dry creek, east." Nell followed the tracks between the trees. The thaw had softened the snow, and she sank to her ankles. Lantern light trembled across the black bark. She found Annie inside the hollow trunk, clutching the bag of food she had hidden beneath her bed. Nell sat down several paces away. "I didn't come to take it." Annie hugged the bag tighter. Nell gathered 12 pebbles and arranged them in 3 rows. She placed 3 knots before the rows, 1 for Annie, 1 for Malcolm, and 1 for herself. Each row is one person's food. She moved the pebbles 1 day at a time. No row emptied first. Annie watched for a long while. Nell tied 1 large loop around all 3 knots, then set the storm lantern in the middle. "This is Pine Watch. The food is inside. All 3 of us are inside too." Annie touched her own knot, then moved 1 pebble from Nell's row to Malcolm's. "No," Nell said softly. "No one has to give up all of her share to make someone else stay." The girl looked up. Nell rose but did not offer her hand. "You may carry the bag back. Tomorrow morning, we'll put it in the pantry on a shelf with your name." Annie crawled out of the hollow tree. On the way home, she walked behind Nell until a branch snapped in the woods. Her small hand immediately caught Nell's sleeve. Nell only slowed her pace so the girl would not have to let go. When they returned, Malcolm was still in the smokehouse. Smoke moved evenly through the 2 vents. He looked at Annie's hand clutching Nell's sleeve, then turned away and adjusted a hanging rail that was already straight. By midnight, the remaining meat had been saved. The cost sat in the hidebound ledger: 1 missed trap run, 2 days of labor lost, and a clear reduction in winter profits. Malcolm did not mention it. The next morning, Nell woke to the sound of hammering. The table by the window stood a handspan lower. Malcolm was nailing a wooden step onto the sleigh. On the wall beside her room, he had added a coat peg at the height of her shoulder. "What are you fixing?" "Things that were built wrong. The table worked fine. For me." He drove the last nail. Nell looked at the sleigh step, the new peg, and the lowered tabletop. All her life she had been told to turn sideways through doorways, pull her skirts close, and take up less room. Malcolm did not ask her to change. He changed the house. You lost a trap run because of me, because of the meat. I was the one who told you to stay. You were right. The two rough words warmed Nell's chest more than the fire. That afternoon, Malcolm took her to inspect the trap line nearest the cabin. The snow had begun to harden. Iron traps lay beneath pine needles, chained to stakes by short lengths of iron. At the fourth set, Malcolm knelt. The spring pin lay several paces from the trap. Its cut edge was flat and bright. Could an animal have done that? Nell asked. No. He laid his hunting knife beside the mark. Steel tool. A boot print, nearly erased by the wind, crossed the snow toward the north line and the rope bridge over the ice gorge. Malcolm stood, his face closed like stone. Someone's on the mountain. One of Silas's men. Don't know. Then don't go alone. He looked toward the pines, where storm clouds gathered beyond Gray Wolf Pass. I already missed one run. The far line holds meat, pelts, and the bridge. If they destroy all three, Pine Watch won't survive the winter. Nell tightened her grip on the lantern. When are you leaving? Before dawn. Wind moved through the trees carrying the smell of new snow. On the way home, Malcolm walked ahead, examining every track. Nell watched his shadow stretch over the snow and understood that the house, which had only just begun to make room for her, was about to send him into a place where someone might be waiting. Malcolm rose before daylight. Nell heard the rifle action outside her room. When she came out, he was already dressed in buckskins and his buffalo coat, fastening a medicine pouch to the saddle. The old long rifle lay within reach. The storm will be here before dark, Nell said. I know, and someone cut the trap pin. I know that too. At the table, Annie held a cup of hot milk and watched her uncle without blinking. Malcolm set 3 knots before her, one large, one small, and one closed loop. He touched the large knot and pointed toward the door, then touched the small one and pointed to Annie. At last, he put the loop in Nell's hand. Hold the house. If I'm not back by dark, keep holding it. Nell closed her fingers around the loop. And if your horse comes home without you, don't come looking. That isn't an answer. It's the answer that keeps you and Annie alive. His severity was not meant to diminish her. It was the habit of a man who believed danger should stop at his own shoulders. That was exactly why it angered her. You cannot give me half the responsibility for this house and forbid me to act if the man carrying the other half disappears. I can if someone out there wants to lure you away from Pine Watch. And if they want to kill you. Malcolm did not answer. He put one hand on the doorframe, looked at her once, then walked into the snow. By noon, the wind had shifted. Nell checked the stores, fed the horses, reinforced the stable, and taught Annie to measure time with pebbles. Every half hour, they moved 1 stone. Malcolm should return before the bowl on the left was empty. Early in the afternoon, his horse burst into the yard without a rider. White foam crusted its mouth. A length of heavy, frayed rope had tangled around one stirrup. Dark blood stained the saddle. Annie dropped the pebble in her hand. Nell caught the reins and examined the stirrup. Bridge rope, not tack. The hemp line from the bridge over the ice gorge had been cut almost through, then snagged the horse as it fled. Red stone mud, found only on the north slope, coated its hind legs. Nell led the horse into the stable and opened the trapline ledger. The line near the cabin took 3 hours. The western line followed the dry creek. Only the northern line crossed the rope bridge beneath the red cliffs. If Malcolm had left at dawn, he would have reached the bridge before noon. The southeast wind was erasing tracks on the homeward trail. The horse carried red mud, which meant it had turned back near the cliffs. Nell closed the ledger. "Uncle Malcolm is hurt," Annie whispered. Nell knelt before her. "I'm going to find him. You stay here. Lock the door. The small rifle is under the table. If you hear 3 bells, open the firewood tunnel. If I'm not back by dark, light the lantern in the east window and do not go outside." Annie shook her head and clutched Nell's sleeve. Nell tied 3 knots close together, then drew Malcolm's knot away without removing it from the cord. Still connected. The girl studied it for a moment, then tied another loop at the end herself. Nell prepared the sleigh with blankets, warm water, clean cloth, whiskey, an axe, 2 iron pulleys, a drag line, a pry bar, and the storm lantern. She cut long strips of cloth for bandages, packed hot coals into a leather-wrapped tin, and placed a sack of dried meat beneath the seat. She hitched the old mare to the sleigh and tested every knot with her full body weight. Nothing was tied, merely because it looked probably strong enough. She pulled, jerked, and tested again until the ropes no longer shifted. By the time she left Pine Watch, the storm had hidden half of Grey Wolf Pass. Hoofprints appeared and vanished. Nell did not chase each track. She trusted the wind, the map, and the trapline stakes. Where the trail forked, she brushed the snow with her hand. The left branch had crusted over, while the right had been broken recently. The light was failing when she reached the bridge. One of the main ropes had been cut. The bridge planks sagged into the gorge. Shell casings and blood marked the snow. "Malcolm!" The wind swallowed his name. Nell raised the lantern and edged toward the drop. About 20 feet below, a fallen pine lay across a rock shelf. Malcolm's buffalo coat showed as a black shape in the snow. On her second call, a hoarse voice answered. She tied a rope around a living pine, fed it through a pulley, and locked the free end around her hips. Snow slid beneath her boots. Once she lost her footing and slammed into the cliff. The drag line cinched her waist but held. Malcolm lay on his side with the trunk pinning his right leg. Blood from a gunshot wound below his ribs had soaked through his buckskins. His eyes opened when she knelt beside him. "I told you to hold the house. You have enough strength to argue, so you're not dead yet." She cut the shirt away from the wound. The bullet had passed through, but blood still seeped from it. Nell pressed folded cloth against the opening and bound it tight around his ribs. "Who shot you?" "2 men. Ran when the tree came down. Listen to me. I have to lift the trunk. When it rises, you pull your leg free. You can't lift it. The horse can." Nell climbed back up, fixed the second pulley to a stump, and ran the rope to the mare. On the first pull, the trunk barely moved. The pulley slipped, and the rope snapped across her shoulder hard enough to drop her to her knees. Pain burned from her neck down her arm. She lay still for one breath, then stood. The angle was wrong. Nell lowered the anchor point, wedged the pry bar beneath the trunk, and tied a second drag line to keep it from rolling onto Malcolm. She had to remove her gloves to feed the rope through a crack in the rocks. Her skin immediately froze to the iron. When she pulled away, a thin patch of flesh tore with it. She wrapped her hand in cloth and kept working. On the second attempt, the mare pulled. The rope screamed. The trunk rose a few inches, then caught. Again. The mare leaned into the harness. The pry bar sprang upward. The trunk lifted clear of Malcolm's leg. He dragged his foot free but slipped. Nell scrambled down, seized his collar, and hauled him toward her. The trunk crashed back behind them and shook the ledge. "Is the leg broken?" she asked. "Don't think so. You don't get to guess." She splinted his leg between two wooden slats, wrapped him in blankets, and secured him to a hide litter. 3 times the litter caught on rocks. Once the holding knot slipped and dragged both of them backward, Nell checked it, changed the anchor, and started over. By the time the sleigh reached the trail, night had fallen. The storm lantern hung at the front, its small halo bent sideways by the wind. Nell walked at the mare's head, one hand on the reins and the other pressed against her injured shoulder. Behind her, Malcolm drifted in and out of consciousness. "Don't sleep." "I'm not sleeping." "You were snoring." "I don't snore." Then the mountain growls with a Scottish accent. A sound almost like a laugh escaped him and became a cough. When Pine Watch appeared, a lantern burned in the east window. Annie had done everything exactly right. She opened the door before the sleigh stopped. Nell did not let her stare long at the wound. Hot water, clean cloth, more firewood. The next 3 days dissolved into the smell of blood, whiskey, and smoke. Outside, snow nearly buried the sleigh. Inside, Annie followed every instruction, counting spoonfuls of salt, changing basins of water, and placing each stick of wood beside the stove in the proper place. She still did not speak, but she never left Nell's sight. Nell washed the wound, changed the dressings, measured water by the cup, and did not let the fire die. The bullet had missed the lung, but infection turned the surrounding skin angry red. Malcolm raved with fever, sometimes calling Annie's name, sometimes apologizing to a woman named Moira. He woke on the second night with one hand wrapped around Nell's wrist. His grip was weaker than the hand that had once dragged deer carcasses through snow, but it still held the instinct of a man who always checked whether the people under his roof were alive. "Annie?" "Safe." "You?" "Angry." He released her, as if those 2 answers were enough. By the 3rd day, the fever began to break. Nell rose to add wood to the stove, but the room tilted. Her right shoulder had swollen stiff from the rope strike. She braced one hand against the table and tried to keep moving. The cup slipped from her fingers. Nell crumpled beside the hearth. A small voice tore through the room. "Nell?" Annie dropped to her knees and caught Nell's arm. It was the first word she had given the world after months of silence. Malcolm tried to sit up. "Bring her here." Nell wanted to object, but she could no longer lift her shoulder. Annie pulled over a chair. As the girl fetched a cold cloth, Malcolm reached for the buffalo coat hanging beside the bed. A folded scrap of paper fell from a pocket. Nell picked it up. The page held a sketch of the bridge and a hurried order. "Cut the north line. Take the ledger if Rourke carries it. Keep the Whitaker woman away from the water claim." Beneath it was the wolf head ink stamp of Coldwater Station. The fire popped softly. Malcolm looked at the note, then at Nell. "They weren't after the traps," she said. "No." Outside, the storm continued burying the road down the mountain. Inside Pine Watch, the name Whitaker had turned every accident into a deliberate hunt. The order lay on the table like a sheathed knife. Nell reread the words, "Whitaker water claim," but pain stabbed through her right shoulder until the letters blurred. Malcolm sat on the bed with one hand holding the bandage below his ribs. "Tomorrow," he said. "Now. You're feverish." "I'm tired." Nell rose to check the stove. Malcolm stood too, slow and rigid, and blocked her path. "I need to change your bandage. Annie can hand me the cloth. The stores. Still locked. The fire. I just fed it." He pulled a chair close to the hearth and draped a blanket over the back. "Sit." Nell looked at the man who had nearly died on the ledge. She was accustomed to doing more than everyone else, merely to be allowed to remain. But Malcolm did not look at the unfinished work, nor did he seem to regret marrying a woman who was in too much pain to lift her arm. He cooked supper. The porridge was thick as paste, the smoked meat cut into uneven pieces, and the bottom of the pot burned black. Without a word, he scraped the scorched portion into his own bowl. "You're a terrible cook," Nell said. "You're still eating." "Because I won't waste food. Then I win." Annie bent over her bowl, but the corner of her mouth lifted. For the next 3 days, Malcolm would not let Nell carry water or lift a sack of beans. He split wood despite the pull at his wound, propped the ledger on a board across her lap so she would not have to bend her shoulder, and carried the wash basin all the way to her door. He always stopped outside the threshold and waited for permission before entering. The disappointment Nell had expected never came. On the second night, she woke to the sound of falling firewood. Malcolm was kneeling beside the stove, one hand gripping his ribs while the other gathered the scattered sticks. Nell started out to help, but he pointed toward the bed. "Sleep. I heard you hurting. Pain won't put the wood in the stove. Then let me. You pulled me off that mountain. You don't owe anything more." The words held Nell still more effectively than any command. She went back to bed and listened to him move through the cabin. No one had ever cared for her without recording the debt somewhere. On the 4th day, Malcolm set coffee within her reach and drew the hide-bound ledger closer. "Start." They spread the marriage papers, receipts, old letters, and the written order across the table. Annie sat at the far end, threading knotted cord through a piece of deerskin. Nell matched the dates. Harlan had begun writing in March. That same week, Silas entered a new debt under his name. 2 months later came an item marked Whitaker marriage expenses. "It wasn't Harlan's money," Nell said. Malcolm nodded. The early letters had even handwriting and long sentences. The later ones contained misspellings and a clumsier hand. 2 men wrote them. Harlan let it slip. Silas invented a husband who never existed. Nell took an old scrap of paper from Aunt Martha out of her trunk. "If I am no longer there, ask about the meadow to the west." Malcolm opened a map of Grey Wolf Pass and pointed to a strip of land at the foot of the mountains. "Cinder Meadow. Every stream coming off Black Pine crosses it before entering the pass." "My aunt owned it?" "Maybe." Nell placed the written order beside the map. Silas hid the inheritance letter. He needed Harlan to marry me, then sign over the land in exchange for clearing his debts. Malcolm studied the map for a long time. "Moira once wanted to buy part of that meadow," he said. Nell remembered the name he had called in his fever. "Your sister?" "Yes. She said Pine Watch needed a route down the mountain that didn't depend on Silas. I told her we had time." His jaw tightened. The next spring, the slide took her and her husband. "You didn't cause the slide." "I didn't go with them." Nell did not tell him he had to forgive himself. She only rested her left hand on the edge of the map, close to his but not touching. "Then this time, we don't let Silas decide Annie's road to survival." Malcolm looked at the rifle on the rafters. "Don't," Nell said. "I didn't say anything." "You're thinking with the rifle." The bell outside rang. A gray mule came into the yard carrying a thin courier in a snow-covered coat. Malcolm took up the rifle and went out. "Ephraim Cole," the man said, raising both hands. "Papers from Helena." Nell brought him into the kitchen, warmed his fingers, and opened the mail pouch. The first document requested a review of Annie's guardianship on the grounds that Malcolm lived in isolation and placed the child in danger. The second carried Silas's statement that Malcolm had taken Eleanor Whitaker from Coldwater under suspicious circumstances. The last challenged the marriage because one page of the record lacked a seal. Malcolm finished reading and reached for his buffalo coat. Nell stood in front of the door. "Where are you going?" "Coldwater." "With that wound still open?" "Closed enough to kill a man." Annie looked up from her cord. "If you shoot Silas, he wins," Nell said. "He wants Annie. He wants you to prove every word he wrote. You ride down there, and the court will call you a savage, say I was forced into marriage, take Annie away, and seize Pine Watch." Malcolm put a hand on the latch. "Move." "No." Nell had seen those eyes clouded with fever. She had pulled him out from beneath the tree. She did not step aside. "Silas doesn't have to live to win. He only needs you to commit a crime. You want me to sit here? I want you to do something harder than pulling a trigger." "What?" "Trust me." The cabin fell so quiet they could hear pine resin snapping in the stove. Malcolm released the latch. The decision made no gunshot, but it seemed to cost him more strength than a fight. Ephraim confirmed that the wolf head stamp on the order belonged to the Coldwater warehouse. He remembered delivering a registered letter for Eleanor Whitaker, but Silas had told him the recipient had not yet arrived. They made 3 sets of evidence. One was hidden beneath a stone in the firewood tunnel. One was sewn into Ephraim's saddlebag. The originals went into a tin box beneath the cold ashes of the auxiliary stove. Malcolm drew the hide-bound ledger toward him. The Winter Prophet page listed only his name. He took up the pen and wrote slowly, "Eleanor Whitaker, 1/3 of the prophets, with equal authority in decisions concerning Pine Watch." Nell looked at the name. "You didn't write Rourke." "It isn't your name. On the marriage record. That paper doesn't erase what belonged to you before you met me." He set the pantry key and the gun cabinet key beside her hand. "Are you sure?" "No." Malcolm leaned back in the chair. "But I trust you more than I trust my anger." It was not a declaration of love. To Nell, it carried more weight than one. The next day, they prepared Pine Watch. Malcolm strung a bell line from the northern approach to the porch. Nell lowered it so falling snow would not cause false alarms. They mounted a pulley to a beam in the fur shed and suspended a limbed pine trunk above the wagon road. Pulling one pin would drop the tree across the entrance. Annie was given 3 knots. Nell made her practice every response until she could perform it in darkness. Malcolm extinguished the lamps and knocked twice on the table, while Annie had to find the tunnel using only the wall beneath her fingers. The first time, she froze. The second time, Nell placed the end of the cord in her hand. The third time, Annie made it all the way down and returned alone, pale-faced but with her chin high. Round knot, run to the firewood tunnel. Double knot, retrieve the document box from beneath the ashes. Long knot, ring the east bell if anyone circles behind the stable. The girl repeated the meanings with her hands, then whispered, round, double, long. Malcolm turned away to inspect the rifle lock. Nell saw his throat move as he swallowed something down. That evening, he carried a basin of water to Nell's room and stopped outside. "Where?" "On the chair." He entered only after she gave permission, set down the basin, and lowered the coat peg another notch. "Shoulder still hurt?" "Yes." "Rest tomorrow. There's still the alarm trap on the south side. I'll do it." You're not healed. Neither are you. Nell started to argue, then realized he no longer divided them into rescuer and rescued. There were only the things the house required, and two people who had to share them. The following morning, Ephraim left Pine Watch with a copy of the evidence. If Silas learns I was here, he warned, he won't wait for the court. Black clouds rolled in from Coldwater. The last storm of the season was rising. Darkness came early. The three of them sat around the stove. The hidebound ledger lay open to the page bearing Eleanor Whitaker's name. The storm lantern burned beside the door. Annie's knotted cords rested in a row. A faint metallic sound came from the woods. The north bell rang once. There was no wind. Malcolm rose and took the old rifle from the rafters. The bell rang a second time. Then, beneath the thickening snow, several horses thundered up the trail toward Pine Watch. The hoofbeats stopped beyond the pines. The north bell gave short, broken notes, torn apart by the storm. Malcolm stood beside the door with the long rifle across his arms. Nell removed the document box from the cold ashes, wrapped it in oilskin, and handed Annie the three knotted cords. Round, tunnel, double, papers. Long, east bell. The girl's voice was quiet, but steady. A rifle butt slammed into the door. Malcolm Rourke, open up in the name of territorial law. Malcolm looked at Nell. He gave no order. He only waited. Nell hooked the pantry key onto her belt, took up the storm lantern, and stepped beside him. Malcolm kept the chain fastened and opened the door no more than a hand's width. 5 men stood in the yard. Silas sat his black horse beneath a cloak covered in snow. Harlan shivered beside him. 2 gunmen spread out to either side. The last man wore a deputy's badge on his sheepskin coat. Silas raised a stack of papers. I have an order to take Annie Rourke into temporary custody and protect Eleanor Whitaker from a forced marriage. You are not protecting me, Nell said. Silas tilted his head, as if an object had suddenly spoken. Once Rourke is restrained, you may tell the truth. I am telling the truth. I signed the agreement of my own will. Silas drew out another page. The final sheet has no validating seal. This marriage is not lawful. Lantern light swept across the document. Nell's forged signature was too rounded. The last stroke in Whitaker curved the wrong way. Let me see it. There's no need. Deputy Briggs has read it. The man wearing the badge avoided her eyes. Silas went on to say that Cinder Meadow was unguarded property, and that he would administer it until the court ruled. You hid my inheritance letter, Nell said. There was no letter. There is a delivery receipt, Harlan's debt ledger, and an order stamped by the Coldwater warehouse directing men to cut the bridge. Harlan went pale. Silas did not look at him. Give me the child, the papers, and the keys. Rourke puts down the rifle. No one has to be hurt. Malcolm worked the action. The metal closed with a neat sound in the wind. Nell placed her hand on the barrel. She did not lower it. She only reminded him that she was still there. We are giving you nothing. Silas jerked the reins and backed away, then made a signal. 1 gunman circled toward the smokehouse. Malcolm raised the rifle, but Nell shook her head. The man was not in a clean line of fire. If Malcolm pulled the trigger, Silas would have the body he needed to support every accusation. A bundle of oil-soaked rags flew through the smokehouse door. Flames caught the dry pine boards. Black smoke rolled upward, and the wind drove the fire toward the pantry and stable. The meat they had saved began to crackle. Annie caught her breath. Round, Nell said. The girl clutched the round knot and ran toward the stove. Malcolm slammed the door just as the first bullet punched through the planks. He fired into a porch post and forced the gunman down behind cover. "They'll drive the fire into the cabin. Hold the door, don't chase them." He looked at her, then nodded. Nell and Annie descended into the firewood tunnel. Smoke had already begun seeping through the floorboards. The document box was tied against Nell's chest, and the storm lantern hung at her hip. They crawled to the hillside door behind the fur shed. Outside, snow whipped sideways across their faces. Long knot. Annie looked through the trees. A shadow was moving toward the stable. She tied the long knot onto the line running beside the fence and pulled 3 times. The east bell rang. Inside the cabin, Malcolm turned his rifle in the correct direction. A shot struck the snow before the gunman's feet and sent him diving behind the water trough. Nell led Annie to the fur shed. The pulley hung from the beam. One end of its rope ran to the suspended pine trunk above the wagon road. The other passed through a breaking stake. Silas shouted, "Burn the stable too! Force them out!" Harlan backed away. "You said we were only taking the papers." "Shut up!" The second gunman carried oil into the narrow approach. Nell pulled the pin. The pine trunk dropped across the road, knocked the oil can from his hands, and trapped his legs beneath the branches. Deputy Briggs drew his revolver. "Stop!" No one listened. Silas fired into the shed. The bullet passed through the wall and made the storm lantern swing violently, but the flame held. Annie crawled to a crack between the boards and placed 3 knots on the floor. 1 man behind the tree, 2 beside the stable. This time she was not merely calling out in fear. She was reporting positions. Nell transferred the knots to the main signal cord running into the cabin. Malcolm saw the warning and moved away from the door, a heartbeat before 2 bullets tore through it. He opened the side door and fired into the wheel of Silas's wagon. The horse panicked and dragged Silas out of his line of aim. The smokehouse fire reached the stacked firewood. Nell had to break the path of the flames before they reached the cabin. She wrapped a line around her waist and gave the break end to Annie. "Hold it until I tell you to release." Annie set her feet in the groove and wrapped the line exactly as she had practiced. Nell ran across the yard and swung the axe into the wooden framework, connecting the smokehouse to the storehouse. A bullet struck beside her boots. Malcolm burst from the doorway and pulled her behind the water trough. The next shot grazed his upper arm and tore his buckskin sleeve. "You've been hit. Only grazed. Go inside. You go inside. No one gets to say that now." Their eyes met through the smoke. Malcolm almost smiled, then turned his rifle outward while Nell chopped through the last support. The framework collapsed. An open strip of snow cut the fire off from the cabin. Silas dragged Harlan forward and pressed a gun into his back. "Tell Briggs she agreed to transfer the land." "I signed nothing," Nell said. "Harlan will testify." Harlan looked at Nell, at the burning smokehouse, and at the gun against his back. The contempt he had shown at the station was gone. Only cowardice remained, driven to the edge. "The letters," he began. Silas shoved the barrel harder into him. "I didn't write all the letters. Mr. Vane wrote most of them. He promised to clear my debt if I married her." Silas cursed. Harlan spoke faster. "After the wedding, I was supposed to get her signature transferring Cinder Meadow. He kept the unsealed page. His men took the salt and ammunition, ruined the traps, and cut the bridge." Briggs turned his revolver toward Silas. "Drop the weapon." Silas pulled the trigger. The barrel was aimed at Annie, who had just appeared in the shed doorway with the document box in her hands. Malcolm lunged. The bullet tore through his upper arm. He dropped to one knee, but still put himself between Annie and the gun. Briggs shot Silas through the hand. The revolver spun into the snow. Harlan threw himself aside. The remaining gunman tried to flee, but Annie yanked the north bell line. The ringing made his horse rear and throw him from the saddle. Malcolm kicked his gun away. Silence returned in layers. First the gunfire stopped, then the horses, then the shouting. At last there was only the storm and the fire, finishing the smokehouse. Briggs bound Silas with reins. He examined the false marriage page by the light of the storm lantern. Nell set the original hidebound ledger, the written order, and the true marriage record beside it. "That is not my signature," she said, "but the name in this ledger is mine." Briggs read the line, "Eleanor Whitaker, equal authority in decisions concerning Pine Watch," then looked at Harlan. "You will repeat your statement in Coldwater." "I will." Annie still held the document box. The smoke-darkened knotted cord wound around her wrist. Malcolm knelt before her even as blood ran down his arm. "Are you hurt?" Annie shook her head, then touched the tear in his sleeve. "We kept the house." Those 4 words changed Pine Watch more than any paper ever had. Near dawn, Silas and the 2 gunmen were locked inside the fur shed. The smokehouse had been reduced to a blackened frame. One corner of the stable was scorched, and the pantry was thick with smoke but had not caught fire. The cabin still stood. Nell cleaned Malcolm's wound. He sat at the table, silently studying her name in the ledger. "Briggs saw everything," she said. "When the pass opens, we can take the evidence down." "Yes. You are capable of saying more than one word." Malcolm looked at her. Weariness had taken some of the cold from his eyes. "I used to think that if the walls were thick enough, the rifle close enough, and I did everything myself, I wouldn't lose anyone else." Nell did not remove her hand from his arm. "You didn't hold this house alone." "No." Annie slept curled in a deerskin near the stove, still clutching the knotted cord. The storm lantern burned from its peg beside the door, its light washing over smoke, mud, and bullet holes in the walls. Malcolm looked around Pine Watch, then back at Nell. He did not tell her she had to stay. He did not remind her that she had saved him. He did not use Annie or the winter to lock her inside the house they had defended with blood. "What do you want to do with Pine Watch?" he asked. Outside, the season's last storm was weakening. Beneath the deep snow, the road to Coldwater would soon open. Spring did not arrive with birdsong. It came with ice cracking beneath Grey Wolf Pass, with black water pouring from the foot of the drifts, and with the smell of wet earth pushing through Pine Watch's wood smoke. 3 weeks after the siege, Malcolm saddled the horses. Only the smokehouse's scorched frame remained. One section of the cabin wall still held unpatched bullet holes. But on the porch, the tin storm lantern hung exactly where it had before. Nell locked the pantry, checked the document box one last time, and handed Annie the knotted cord. "You keep it." Annie wrapped it around her wrist. "We're coming home, aren't we?" The question stopped Malcolm's hands on the reins. Nell looked down the mud and snow road opening toward Coldwater. "We'll know after everyone has the right to choose." Malcolm asked nothing more. It took them 3 days to descend the mountain. The trail ran with meltwater and was blocked by fallen trees and mud holes deep enough to reach the wagon axles. Malcolm went ahead with the axe. Nell kept the supply ledger, checked the harness lines, and let Annie read the trail markers for herself. When the roof of Coldwater Station came into view, none of the 3 spoke. The platform looked the same: gray planks, the flour warehouse, Silas's office door, and the signal post around which Nell had once wrapped the braking rope. Only the crowd looked at her differently. Not because her body had grown smaller. Nell still had rounded shoulders, broad hips, and full legs. The body that had made Harlan step away, as though the railroad had delivered him a mistake. What had changed was the way she stood. She climbed down from the wagon with the Pine Watch key at her hip and the document box beneath her arm, while Malcolm did not walk ahead to clear a path. He walked beside her. Silas was being held in the old storeroom until territorial officers could take him to Helena. Bars covered the window. When Nell passed, he stood in the shadows. "You think Rourke will let you keep that land?" Nell did not stop. "You still don't understand. No one lets me keep what belongs to me." Inside the clerk's office, Briggs, Ephraim Cole, and a circuit judge were waiting. Harlan sat in a corner with his hat crushed between his knees. He did not look at Nell until he was called to testify. Harlan confirmed that Silas had written most of the courtship letters, paid the cost of bringing Nell to Coldwater, and promised to erase his debts if he married her. After the wedding, Harlan was supposed to obtain her signature giving Silas control of Cinder Meadow. He also confirmed that Silas had kept the unsealed marriage page, shorted Pine Watch's supplies, and hired men to sabotage the trap lines. "Why did you reject Miss Whitaker at the station?" the judge asked. Harlan said nothing. "Answer. Because I thought," he swallowed, "I thought a wife like her would make people laugh at me." Nell looked at him. "And now?" Harlan stared at his hands. "Now I think I was a fool." Nell did not forgive him. She had no need to. Her life no longer depended on whether a cowardly man understood her worth. By late afternoon, every paper had been placed on the desk. Nell and Malcolm's marriage was declared valid on the strength of their signatures, Clerk Caro's testimony, and proof that Silas had intentionally withheld the seal. Annie's guardianship was formally awarded to Malcolm, with Nell named co-guardian for as long as the marriage remained in effect. The deed to Cinder Meadow was stamped by the territory in the name of Eleanor Whitaker. The water rights belonged to her. The hide-bound ledger established Nell's share of the winter profits, proceeds from the pelts, compensation for the stolen supplies, and her portion of the value of the goods remaining at Pine Watch. When the clerk pushed the money pouch toward her, Nell did not touch it at once. All her life she had been taught that a woman like her should be grateful for whatever was thrown at her feet. But this was not charity. She had earned this money. Nell took it. Outside on the platform, the train for St. Louis was taking on water. Steam whitened the tracks. Malcolm stood beside the bench where Nell had set her trunk and storm lantern on her first day. Annie sat nearby with both hands wrapped around the knotted cord. Malcolm handed Nell an envelope. Inside were a train ticket, her separate money counted in full, and a document ending every obligation under the winter agreement. Nell read the final line. Eleanor Whitaker owes Malcolm Rourke nothing for food, shelter, protection, profits, or any marital obligation. When did you prepare this? Before we came down. You thought I would leave. You have the right. That isn't an answer. Malcolm looked toward the train. The scar along his jaw showed white in the spring sun. I thought that if I asked you to stay, you would wonder whether it was what you wanted or what you owed. Annie lowered her head. Her small fingers tightened around the cord, but she did not cry or plead. Nell understood that Malcolm had taught Annie the hardest lesson of all. Loving someone did not give you the right to lock the door. And Pine Watch? Nell asked. Your share of the profits remains yours. Cinder Meadow is yours. If you want to sell the water rights, I won't stand in your way. And you? I'm going back to the mountain. Only 6 words. He did not mention that she had pulled him from the ledge. He did not mention the bullet wound, the fevered nights, or the house they had held together. He did not use Annie as a cord to bind her. Malcolm gave her every reason to leave. It was the final way he proved that he loved her. The train whistle sounded. Nell embraced Annie. The girl brought her mouth close to Nell's ear. The door isn't locked. Nell kissed her hair. I know. She walked alone down the platform. Malcolm did not call after her. He did not follow. When Nell disappeared behind the warehouse, he lifted Annie onto the wagon and turned the horses toward the Black Pine Range. He did not look back, because if he did, he might forget that an open door had to allow a person to walk out. Nell stood behind the warehouse until their wagon vanished. Then she entered the ticket office. I want to sell back my ticket to St. Louis. The ticket agent looked up. Are you certain? I have never been more certain. The next morning, Nell bought cabbage, turnip, bean, and onion seed. She bought 2 milk goats, nails, hinges, salt, gunpowder, window glass, and lumber to rebuild the smokehouse. She hired a freight wagon and paid in advance with her own money. The last thing she ordered was a pine signboard. The carpenter asked whose name should be carved first. Nell set the pine watch key on his workbench. No one's comes first. 6 days later, wagon wheels sounded on the Pine Watch trail. Malcolm was repairing the smokehouse roof. He straightened when he saw 2 goats tied behind the wagon, then took in the sacks of seed, the keg of nails, and the canvas-covered sign. Annie burst from the cabin, but stopped on the porch step, as if remembering that Nell had to travel the last stretch of road on her own. Nell climbed down from the wagon. She still wore the wine-colored cloak that snow and mud had faded. The iron key rested in her hand. Malcolm stood beside the open door. He did not come out and pull her inside. He did not ask whether she had changed her mind again. The door is still open, he said. I was only waiting for you to cross it yourself. Nell walked up onto the porch. She used her own key to unlock the door that already stood open, then turned and pulled the canvas from the sign. Fresh lettering appeared in the sunlight. Pine Watch, Rourke and Whitaker Winter Lodging and Fur Trade. The tin storm lantern hung directly beneath it. I brought my land, Nell said, my money, my seed. The 2 goats are mine too, though the gray one appears to believe she belongs only to herself. Annie laughed. Nell looked at Malcolm. I did not come back because I owe you. I know. Not because I had nowhere else to go. I know, and not to be your storekeeper. Malcolm descended 1 step. His gray eyes held her with attention, not ownership. Then why did you come back? To build a home. Nell drew the document ending their agreement from her pocket and placed it in his hand. The winter marriage is over. Malcolm looked at the paper. Yes. I want a different marriage. Terms? No end date. Pine Watch and the business belong in both our names. Annie has a voice in anything that belongs to her, and no one walks alone into a trap just because he thinks he has to carry every danger himself. The corner of Malcolm's mouth moved. That last one will be difficult. Then write it in bold. He set the paper aside. And the rights to your body. Nell stepped closer and placed her hand against the buckskin over his chest. They still belong to me. Yes. And this time, I choose to give them. She pulled him down. The kiss did not taste of gratitude or rescue. It tasted of bitter coffee, pine wind, and spring breaking through ice. Malcolm placed his hands at her waist, and held her like a man who had been invited, not one who owned. When they drew apart, Annie had turned away, but her narrow shoulders shook with laughter. Nell crossed the threshold. The storm lantern swayed beneath the sign bearing her name. A fire burned in the kitchen. On the lowered table, the hide-bound ledger lay open to the page marked Eleanor Whitaker. At the beginning of winter, Nell had arrived in Coldwater like a bride returned to sender. When spring came, she returned to the mountain as a woman with land, money, the right to leave, and her name on the roof of the home she had chosen for herself.